Hello, introductory psychology students, and thank you so much for joining me for this video. So for this video, I'm going to do a quick review of Module 14, which talks about development during infancy and childhood. Okay, so I just wanted to revisit some of the things we discussed in my last video. So I'm going to talk about more of the preferences and abilities that infants seem to come into the world with. And then we're going to talk about the development of the brain during infancy and shortly after birth. Okay, so as we talked about in my last video, newborns have a very strong preference for human faces as opposed to random geometric shapes. They can also discriminate between their mother's voice and other female voices very shortly after birth. They can distinguish the smell of their mother's breast milk as compared to other females' breast milk. Like I said in my last video, they prefer sweet tastes. They react sort of negatively or with disgust to sour tastes. And they even notice differences in breast milk taste. So they're able to, like I said, discriminate between the taste of their mother's breast milk and other breast milk. They can react to touch. So they have they can respond to tactile stimulation very shortly after birth. They can also respond to pain, okay? So they have a myriad of sensory abilities shortly after birth, but one sensory ability that is really underdeveloped at this stage, at the newborn stage, is vision. So infants have blurred vision for several months, which represents a kind of deficiency compared to their other sensory abilities. So now let's talk a little bit about infant brain development. Right? So an infant's brain is going to grow very rapidly during the first year of life, more than doubling in size. And this sort of dramatic growth period predominantly occurs for the green tissue, which is gray matter. And gray matter is predominantly comprised of axons, okay? So there's a lot of growth in terms of axon length and synapses of which make up the gray matter. And in addition, there's a really prominent increase in the amount of myelin that is produced around those axons, which is going to improve the efficiency of the child's neural communication. Okay, and that myelinated white matter is shown in red. The most significant aspect of brain development, though, happens not in terms of the number of neurons, but rather the number of neural connections, right? So, like I said, at birth, an infant's brain has roughly the same number of neurons as that of an adult. But as the infant matures, the connections between dendrites of, sending and receiving neurons grow increasingly complex, and they become refined based on experiences. Okay? In terms of how the brain develops, brain development begins at about 16 days post-conception, and in the womb, the number of neurons grows by about 750,000 new cells per minute in the second trimester. There's also rapid brain development in the womb and immediately after birth. And the creation of new neurons is mostly complete by the end of the 5th month of fetal development. And like I said, infants have about 100 billion neurons at birth, which is equivalent to the number of neurons that adults have. So let's talk about kind of the sequence of brain development in infants. So during infancy, the main regions of the brain to undergo development are the brainstem, the limbic system, and the motor and sensory strips, which makes sense because these are the brain areas that are most critical for basic survival skills. Whereas early childhood, we're going to see a lot of growth in what are called the association areas. And those are essentially the areas responsible for a lot of cognition, right? So attention, control, thinking, memory, and language. So really these are the brain structures that are going to be most modified by experience or by learning in particular. And again, we see rapid growth in terms of the number of neural connections. And like I said, those neural connections are going to be forged as a result of experience. So we see at birth, there's not very many neural connections, but by the age of 15 months, those neural connections have proliferated fairly rapidly. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about brain development in childhood through young adulthood. Well, I just showed you kind of the rapid growth of those synaptic connections. But something happens typically in adolescence that kind of increases efficiency. Right? So essentially, during adolescence, there's a period of what's called synaptic pruning, and that is essentially getting rid of weak or unused connections, allowing more productive ones to become stronger. Okay? So there's a decrease in neural connections that are no longer useful, essentially, and that sculpting or pruning of neural connections continues even throughout our 20s, okay? So it's a fairly continuous process. Excuse me. Okay. One of the most famous experiments in developmental psychology that seems to support the notion that neural connections are a function of what we know or a function of what we've learned in our environment was actually conducted on rats. So rats with an enriched environment with lots of toys and with other rats experience greater increases in brain weight and synaptic connections. Okay, so in this experiment, they had one cage that was meant to represent an impoverished environment. So the rat kind of lived by itself with food and water and didn't have any sort of social connections or any kind of stimulation in its environment. Whereas rats that were exposed to what was called an enriched environment where they have, structures and various things to play with, and they're able to interact with the other rats, they showed a lot more of those critical neural connections. Okay? So again, what this seems to suggest is that neural connections are proliferated as a result of having an enriched environment with lots of social connections being formed and also lots of things to stimulate the infant's mind, for example. So between the ages of 3 and 6, the greatest increase in neural connections occurs in the frontal lobes, which is the area of the brain involved in planning and attention. Okay? And as more links are established, more associations can be made between different stimuli and between behavior and consequences. So the number decreases by about, the number of neural connections rather, is going to decrease by around 40 or 50% by the time the child reaches puberty. Okay? So that process of synaptic pruning is going to trim back, if you will, a lot of unused synaptic connections in service of making the brain more efficient, essentially. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about physical development. So motor development, the primary cause of physical maturation in this respect is because of development of the cerebellum. So like I said, maturation takes place in the body and cerebellum, enabling kind of a universal sequence. So most infants in the world will proceed in this sequence, and it's very unlikely that, rigorous physical training or something like that will alter the timing of this sequence. So most infants are able to sit unsupported by about 6 months. They start crawling by 8 or 9 months, and they begin to walk anywhere between 9 months and 12 months, and they're walking independently by about 15 months. And studies with identical twins have shown that rushing kids to learn to walk or learn to climb stairs doesn't really seem to do much to make it happen sooner than it would happen anyway. Okay, so this is a universal sequence that occurs when there is an appropriate level of neural development, predominantly in the cerebellum, and there's not very much as far as experience that will change that course of development. Okay, so here we're moving from situations where experience is going to be pivotal to situations where physical development is going to occur at a predetermined, in a predetermined sequence, regardless of experience. Okay. We can also talk about some interesting features of infant memory. Okay. So, for example, one really famous study showed that if you put infants in a crib with a mobile that's set up so that a little sock is attached to the mobile, and infants can kick to get the mobile to, spin or to turn it on. Infants will learn very, very quickly to kick to get the mobile to turn. But if you put them in a new crib with a different environment, they won't show that response. So it appears that infants are actually forming memories of or mental representations of their environment, and those memories are dictating their behavior. And interestingly enough, if you show the infant the mobile and they learn that they can kick it to make it spin, they will remember that and make the same response like a month or 2 months or even 6 months later. So for a long time it was believed that infants weren't capable of making memories because most people don't remember their first 2 to 3 years of life. And that's called infantile amnesia. So most researchers assume that during this period of development, you don't really remember anything. But in actuality, we do make memories as an infant. It's just with all of the proliferations in neural connections and also the rapid changes in language that occur after the age of 2 or 3, we're no longer able to access those memories. So how do we know that infants are capable of remembering. Well, one of the famous studies was the Rene Collier study with immobiles, but there have been other studies as well. So, for example, traces of forgotten childhood languages can also persist. So, one study tested English-speaking British adults who had no conscious memory of the Hindi or Zulu that they had spoken as children. Yet, up to the age of 40, they could relearn subtle sound contrasts in these languages that other English speakers could not learn. Okay, so clearly they retained something in these early life experiences, although they weren't consciously aware of it. Okay, and similarly, people who were adopted from China as children or as infants and lived in Canada since about the age of 1 are able to process Chinese sounds as do fluent Chinese speakers, even though they have no conscious recollection of Chinese words. Okay, so we kind of see how the mind, or how we can conceive of the mind as having 2 tracks, right? So there's the conscious mind, and also what those procedural memories are able to give us in terms of our abilities, right? So we have the conscious track, which is explicit memory, and that's sort of that unconscious track, which is implicit memory. So there's a lot of what we remember that we're not actually able to consciously recall. Most notably, like I said, in terms of these early life experiences, where we don't necessarily have the ability to recall them consciously, we do have memory traces from those early days. Okay, so now let's start talking about some of those stage theories of development, most notably Piaget and his theory of cognitive development. So Piaget was one of the most famous developmental psychologists. I think your book said that Piaget is to developmental psychology what Shakespeare was to English literature. So he definitely had a very, very prominent role and gave us a lot of really, really interesting information about children. So Piaget, for example, was the first person to assert that children are actually thinking quite differently than adults. So, for example, psychologists like Freud and Carl Jung essentially saw children as tiny adults, right? So they asserted that even though their physical maturation hasn't happened yet, they think in the same way that adults do. And Piaget was the first person to challenge that notion. Okay, so essentially he believed that children are young scientists, or that they're active thinkers, and that their mind develops through a series of universal, irreversible stages from simple reflexes all the way up to the abstract reasoning that characterizes adulthood. So here's a picture that kind of graphically represents each of Piaget's stages of cognitive development. So I'm just going to give a kind of brief overview of each of these, and then we'll look at them individually. So first we have the sensory motor period. And essentially during this period, from about birth to 2 years of age, the child is going to use his sensory capabilities and motor activities to learn about the world. And he's also going to develop what's called object permanence. During the pre-operational stage, from about 2 to 7 years of age, the child is going to start to develop what's called symbolic thinking to explore and understand the world. And children at this age are also known for what's called egocentrism, which we'll see. During the concrete operational stage, from about 7 to 11 years of age, the child is going to begin to understand mental operations, like, for example, mathematics. And he's going to think more logically in reference to objects and circumstances. And then from 11 years of age and beyond, the child is going to be in what's called the formal operational stage, where they're able to think logically and systematically, and they're also going to be capable of hypothetical thinking. Okay? So let's start out with the sensory motor stage, right? So this is essentially when the child is, again, using their sensory abilities primarily to learn about the world. And the child is going to begin to develop tools for thinking and reasoning. And those are going to change and as a function of experience or as a function of development. Piaget essentially believed in a process called adaptation, where a child's understanding of the world changes as a result of experience. And he developed the concept of what he called schemas, and he differentiated between what's called assimilation and accommodation. So we'll get to that in just a moment. But I also wanted to kind of further define for you what object permanence is. So object permanence is essentially the awareness that things continue to exist even when they're not perceived, right? So I showed you the video of an infant who did not display object permanence. So object permanence is established around 6 months of age. But essentially, if you've ever watched an infant, or maybe if you have children yourself, if you've ever played peekaboo with an infant, the reason why they find this game so fun is because they are not able to grasp the fact that when your face is hidden from view, you actually continue to exist, right? So they think that anything that's been occluded or, blocked from their vision, it has just disappeared permanently. And so when you open your hands or, lift the blanket off your face or whatever, and you're still there, the infant can't believe it. They're so excited. And so that's why peekaboo is a favorite game for infants younger than 6 months. Okay, so let's get more into those concepts of assimilation and accommodation. Okay, well, first of all, a schema is a collection of ideas that represent a basic unit of understanding. Okay, so you'll see what I mean in just a second on the next slide. The process of assimilation is using existing information and ideas to understand new knowledge or experiences, okay? So you're essentially incorporating new information into an existing schema, and accommodation is restructuring of old ideas to make a place for new information, right? So with assimilation, you're incorporating new information into an existing schema, whereas with accommodation, you're essentially making a new schema. Okay, so let's look at an example. So the infant develops a schema that represents a dog, right? So that schema might include things like has 4 legs, has floppy ears, has a tail, etc. Right? So that's a schema. That means if I see something with fur and 4 legs and a tail, that means it's a dog. Right? So if the infant, so kind of the first thing an infant does when incorporating new information, in this case a cat, is he attempts to generalize the concept, right? So he says, okay, this new creature that I've never seen before has a tail and fur and 4 legs, so I'm going to assume that it's a dog, right? So the infant generalizes this new concept and tries to assimilate cat into a dog schema, right? But the parent corrects the infant and says, no, honey, this isn't a doggy, it's a kitty, right? So then the infant is going to accommodate the animal schema, if you will, and develop 2 separate categories for cats and dogs, right? Okay. So now researchers believe that Piaget and his followers may have actually underestimated how competent young children are, right? So for example, infants look longer at and explore impossible scenes or events that violate their expectations, right? So infants essentially show evidence of surprise whenever they see situations that are impossible or that violate their expectations. And infants are also able to understand various things related to quantity, right? So, for example, researchers showed 5-month-olds 1 or 2 objects, okay? Then they hid the objects behind a screen and visibly removed or added one. Okay, so the quantity changed. And when she lifted the screen, the infant sometimes did a double take, staring longer when the wrong number of objects was placed, right? So that's an example of infants being able to represent things like quantity or detect when things that were when things happen that were not expected or not consistent with their understanding, right? Same thing happens if you show an infant a train going down a little ramp thing or a track, and then you pull a screen down and you put something to block the car from going down the track. If the infant then sees the train going down the track, even with the block in front of it, they'll look a lot longer and show a lot of surprise for that impossible event than for the train just pulling down the track, right? So infants are able to understand events that are expected. And they show surprise or even concern when unexpected things happen, right? So they really are able to understand a lot of basic principles of things like quantity, and they're able to understand that a train can't move if there's something blocking it, right? Like I said, young children are able to establish a lot more competency in terms of their cognition than maybe Piaget gave them credit for. Okay, so now we're up to the pre-operational stage. So this stage persists from about 2 to 7 years of age. So at this point, children can use language, but they can't yet perform things like mental operations, and specifically they don't show evidence of concrete logic yet. Okay, so during this stage, children don't display an understanding of conservation, which we'll get to in just a second, and they're also known during the pre-operational stage to display what's called egocentrism or the curse of knowledge. So let's start with the test of Piaget's test of conservation. So you guys saw this in the video, but essentially the child is shown 2 equally sized cups of liquid, and then the researcher pours one of the cups into a thinner, taller glass, okay? And the child is asked which glass has more in it. And essentially they don't realize that a change in form doesn't necessarily mean a change in amount. And so the child will always pick the taller glass, even though the amount of liquid is the same, right? So children display a lack of understanding of conservation during this stage. They also show what's called egocentrism. Okay, so this problem, known as the false belief task, illustrates how researchers explore children's presumptions about others' mental states, right? So we say that individuals have theory of mind when they're able to read and interpret the mental state of others accurately, okay? And a lot of children display what's called egocentrism because they're unable to do that, okay? So what is the false belief task? Well, it's essentially a task where the children are exposed to two different characters. So there's Sally and then there's Anne. And Sally puts her ball into a red cupboard, and then Sally goes away. And while Sally is gone, Anne moves the ball to the blue cupboard. So the children are asked, where will Sally look for the ball? And children who are egocentric or who have not developed theory of mind will use their own beliefs or their own knowledge as an indication of what Sally knows, right? So because the children know that the ball was placed in the blue cupboard, okay, they will say that Sally will look for the ball in the blue cupboard because that's where they themselves would look, okay? But obviously Sally was gone when Anne moved the ball to the blue cupboard. So in reality, right, those who have theory of mind would know that Sally would look in the red cupboard or the pink cupboard because that's where she left the ball, right? So between the ages of 3.5 and 4.5, children worldwide, regardless of culture, a language, anything like that, will use theory of mind to realize that others may hold false beliefs, right? So that's why it's called the false belief task, is Sally essentially holds the false belief that her ball is in the red cupboard, even when in reality it's in the blue cupboard, right? So by age 4 to 5, children anticipate the false belief. So by age 4 and 5, children can appropriately say that Sally will look in the red cupboard. But prior to that, they can't. So another example of the same sort of task where young children show egocentrism is if you were to, for example, take an empty bag of candy, right? So maybe a bag of Snickers or something like that, and put a child's toy in it, maybe their favorite Matchbox car, and you wrap up the bag and give it to them, and they look in the bag anticipating that there's candy, and they find their car, right? So if you were to ask that child, if we were to give this bag to Grandma, what would she think was inside, right? Well, the right answer is Grandma would falsely think that there's candy on the inside because it's a candy wrapper, candy bag. But children who show egocentrism would say Grandma's going to think there's cars in here, right? Because they're unable to distinguish between their own knowledge and understanding and the knowledge and understanding of another person. Okay. So again, now concrete operational, that is when from the age of about 7 to 11 years of age, when children begin to gain the capacity to do mental operations, and that's going to enable them to think logically about concrete events, okay, so things like mathematics, and they also begin to understand that changes in form are different than changes in quantity, or they know the difference between changes in form and changes in quantity, so they begin to understand simple math and conservation. And by the formal operational stage, which begins in adolescence through adulthood, they're no longer limited to concrete reasoning based on actual experience, so now they can think abstractly. Okay, so let's just do a quick review. We have the sensory motory stage from birth to 2 years, and during that birth to 2 years stage, the child masters object permanence at about 6 months and shows stranger anxiety at about 13 months. For the pre-operational stage, they begin representing things with words and images or symbols, and they are predominantly engaged in things like pretend play, but they also show egocentrism for most of this stage until they develop theory of mind at about the age of 5 years old. For the concrete operational stage, they begin thinking logically about concrete things, and they start grasping things like analogies and performing basic mathematical operations. So they develop at this age an understanding of conservation and basic mathematics. And then the formal operation stage begins during adolescence and persists through early and emerging adulthood, where they're able to engage in abstract reasoning, and also they show an increased potential for things like moral reasoning. Okay, so let's kind of reflect on Piaget's theory and maybe identify some of the key criticisms. So Piaget was able to identify significant cognitive milestones, and he was also very effective at increasing sort of worldwide interest in cognitive development. His research findings, though, or more recent research findings, suggest that the sequence of cognitive milestones unfold basically as Piaget proposed. However, development is more continuous or gradual than Piaget theorized. And also children show a lot of more competency in terms of their ability to engage in basic cognition much earlier than Piaget's theory revealed, particularly during infancy. So what can we take away from Piaget's theory? Well, we can understand that very young children are capable of are incapable of adult logic. Okay? So very young children don't understand logic and abstract reasoning in the way that adults do. Children are active, not passive learners. Okay? So they need to actively engage with their environment in order to learn. Child cognition flourishes when adults build on what children know and engage them in concrete demonstrations and stimulate creative thinking. Okay? So essentially, the more time you spend with a child, like I said, building upon what they already know and giving them opportunities to assert that knowledge, the better they're going to be. And also in many cases, their relative immaturity compared to adults is adaptive in terms of their understanding of the world and their physical maturation and how those things interact. Okay? Really quickly, I also wanted to point out Vygotsky's theory, which is also a very prominent theory, or was a very prominent theory in developmental psychology. So essentially, his theory argued that children's minds grow through interaction with their physical environment, and by about the age of 7, children are able to think and solve problems with words. Parents and others can provide a temporary scaffold to facilitate the child's higher level of thinking. And specifically, the language of a child's culture is used in internalized inner speech. Okay, so again, the idea of internal speech was a major component of his theory, and also that social interaction and interaction with the physical environment were central for the child's development. Okay, so now let's move into social development, specifically the idea of attachment. So broadly defined, physical attachment is just the emotional ties that we form, or that form between infants, children, and their caregivers. Okay? So, for example, young children often seek closeness to their caregiver and show distress during separation, which is evidence of attachment. At about 8 months, pretty soon after object permanence develops, children will display stranger anxiety or separation anxiety, which peaks around 13 months. And also infants form attachments not just because the parents gratify biological needs, but also because they are comfortable, familiar, and responsive. So you hopefully you guys got a chance to watch the video with Harry and Margaret Harlow and their experiments with monkeys. So essentially what they showed with these experiments is they kind of challenged behavioristic notions of attachment. So behaviorists would argue that infants and children bond with their caregivers not because of a concept like an internal abstract concept like love, for example, but simply because bonding with their caregivers is reinforcing, right? So if you bond with your caregiver, they're going to give you sustenance or food, and they're going to aid in your survival. So essentially, the strict behaviorist argument is that anyone that gives you food, gives the infant food and support for survival, the infant is going to attach to them, right? So to formally test this assumption, the Harlows used rhesus monkeys as their subjects, and they gave them 2 artificial mothers. So one was a wire mother that provided, and the wire mothers provided bottles for the monkeys, okay? And one was a cloth mother that was wrapped in a towel, okay? And essentially what they found is that even when monkeys were fed by the wire mother, they spent 15 to 18 hours a day with the cloth mother, okay? And in further experiments, when the infant was exposed to something scary or something that was anxiety-provoking or that the monkey perceived as dangerous, they would go to the cloth mother for comfort, okay? So essentially what they argued is that physical comfort is important for secure attachment, not just being rewarded with food, okay? And that was the major breakthrough of the time, is that infants have to have not just food, but physical contact in order to bond with the caregiver. Okay, some other key concepts in terms of attachment theory and social development was the idea of a critical period. So there's an optimal period early in life when exposure to certain stimuli or experiences produces normal development. So we see this most definitively with language. So, for example, there was a case of really horrific child abuse where a young girl who was given the moniker of Jeannie was raised in total isolation. So she was kept in a dark room, and she was either locked in a crib or tied to a potty chair. And she was raised in complete isolation. She was given a limited amount of food, but she was not permitted to talk or interact with her parents at all. And as a result of that, she never acquired language. So she was able to learn some new words for things. So she was able to acquire a modest vocabulary. But she was never able to, for example, use grammatically correct sentences or anything like that. So that suggests, again, that there's a critical period for language. And through Konrad Lorenz's experiments with ducks, he was able to show that there's a process by which certain animals form strong attachments during early life. So, for example, he demonstrated that ducks will imprint on the first moving thing they see, which in this case was him. Okay? All right. So, other concepts relevant to the study of attachment is the idea of the strange situation experiments and what they revealed about attachment styles and parenting. So, essentially, the strange situation experiments demonstrated that some children are securely attached while others are insecurely attached, and that infants' attachment styles were caused by both their individual temperament and the responsiveness of their parents or child care providers. And also that early attachment influences later adult relationships and comfort with things like affection and intimacy. So let me show you more about the strange situation experiments. Okay. So with the strange situation experiments, what would happen is the infant and its mother would play. So usually there would be a playroom set up with lots of different toys. So the infant would play while its mother sat there watching. Okay, so the mother sits and the infant plays by himself. And then a stranger enters and talks to the mother while the infant plays by himself. And then the parent leaves and the infant plays while a stranger watches and provides comfort, essentially. So the child begins to develop separation anxiety, okay? And then the parent returns and greets the infant, offering comfort if needed, and the stranger leaves. Okay, so essentially, what the strange situation experiment attempted to show is, or attempted to examine, is how the child behaves when the mother's not in the room, and how quickly the child calms down after the mother returns. Okay, so an infant with, so again, in this experiment, infants were left by their mothers in an unfamiliar room, And regardless of whether the infant had experienced something like daycare, the percentage of children who cried when the mother left the room peaked at about 13 months of age. Okay, so regardless of of whether the children had been in daycare or raised at home with their mother, they showed the peak amount of crying and distress when their mothers left at around 13 months of age. So that's kind of, like I said, the peak in separation anxiety. Okay, so again, we can use the strange situation experiment to look at things like separation anxiety, but it also tells us something about the attachment of the children and whether it's secure or insecure. So secure attachment is shown by about 60% of infants, and with secure attachment, in their mother's presence, these children play comfortably, are happily exploring their new environment. When she leaves, they become upset, and when she returns, they seek contact with her. They have sensitive, responsive mothers, okay? And that's really critical for secure attachment. So essentially, if mothers are responsive to the child's needs and show them adequate attention and satisfy their needs, the infant is going to be securely attached. With insecure attachment, infants avoid attachment or show insecure attachment, which is marked by either anxiety or avoidance of relationships. So these children are less likely to explore and may cling to their mother. When she leaves, they may cry loudly and remain upset. And there's also avoidantly attached infants who seem not to notice or care about their mother's departure and return. Okay, so children can be avoidant or anxious in insecure attachment when their mothers have previously been unresponsive to their needs. Okay, so again, responsive mothers are critical for secure attachment, and if the mother has not established a responsive relationship with their infant, they will be insecurely attached. Okay, so again, how do infant attachment styles affect later relationships? Well, Erik Erikson believed that securely attached children approach life with a sense of basic trust. So basic trust is essentially a sense that the world is predictable and trustworthy, and this forms during infancy through appropriate experiences and responsive caregivers. So many researchers now believe that our early attachments are going to form the foundation of our adult relationships, and they're going to determine how comfortable or familiar we are with affection and intimacy. So people who report secure relationships with their parents tend to enjoy secure friendships. Students leaving home to attend college tend to adjust well if they're closely attached with their parents. And children with sensitive, responsive mothers tend to flourish both socially and academically. So these bonds that we forge early in infancy are going to be really important in terms of determining how well we attach with other people in our lives during emerging in later adulthood. Okay. So let's talk about some of the consequences of insecure attachment, or even a deprivation of attachment. So most children growing up in adversity or experiencing abuse tend to rate highly on adaptive psychological traits like resiliency. But, like I said, children who are severely neglected by their parents or otherwise prevented from forming attachments, like Jeannie, for example, at an early age may be at a risk for attachment problems. And without a break from their abusive past or a lot of time to kind of readjust, children won't readily recover. So one of the prime situations for developmental psychologists to study the effects of severe deprivation on attachment was in the 1980s, when individuals living in Romania were required to have at least 5 children. Okay, so as a result of that, unfortunately, many individuals weren't able to provide economically for so many children. And so as a result of that, they were forced to leave their children in orphanages, right? So in the 1980s, in Romanian orphanages, there were about 250 children between the ages of 1 and 5, and they outnumbered their caregivers 15-1. Okay? So when these children were tested after Romania's dictator was assassinated, they had significantly lower intelligence scores and double the rate of anxiety problems found in children assigned to higher quality foster care settings. Okay? So this research lends support to the notion that children being reared in individual households is significantly better than being raised in an orphanage. But it should also be kept in mind that these children were severely deprived of any sort of attention or physical affection or anything of that sort. They spent almost all of their days in their cribs. So they also showed deficiencies in motor development as well. And this kind of goes back to the experiment I told you about with the rats who were reared in either cages by themselves or cages with other rats and more stimulation, that they forged more neural connections. So one of the reasons that these children later had much lower scores on intelligence tests is simply that they didn't have exposure to stimulating or nurturing environments. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is parenting styles and what's called the self-concept. So the self-concept is essentially an understanding and evaluation of who we are. And this is going to emerge fairly gradually. So around 6 months, we begin to develop some self-awareness with self-recognition in a mirror, right? So around 6 months, we acknowledge that the person in the mirror is in fact ourselves, whereas before that, one of the reasons that babies are fascinated by mirrors is they don't know who the person is that they keep seeing in the mirror. Around 15 to 18 months, infants will develop a schema of how the face should look. During school age, they're able to give more detailed descriptions of themselves, such as gender, psychological traits. They also begin making comparisons between themselves and their peers. And around 8 to 10 years old, their identity or self-image becomes much more stable. So self-concept is essentially the capacity to answer a question, the question of who we are. So lastly, I wanted to discuss briefly different parenting styles. So authoritarian parents are coercive, and they impose very strict rules and expect obedience. So those would be the strictest parents, whereas permissive parents are too lenient, right? So they make very few demands and set few limits on their children, and they use very little punishment. Whereas authoritative parents are confrontive, okay, and they do things like impose rules and associate those rules with consequences. But especially when their children are older, they encourage open discussion about the rules, and they allow certain expectations. So essentially, it's a Goldilocks situation. So authoritarian parents are too strict and coercive. Permissive parents are not strict or coercive enough. And authoritative parents are somewhere in the middle. And authoritative parents are much more likely to raise children who are self-confident and have high self-esteem. Negligent parents, as the name would suggest, tend to be uninvolved. They are neither demanding nor responsive, and they don't seek close relationships with children. So those would be individuals, for example, who are at high risk to have children who are in foster care or in placement, things like that. And obviously those situations are associated with more problematic outcomes in terms of the child's capacity for attachment and things like that. Okay, so this video concludes my brief review of Module 14, which talks about infancy and childhood. Certainly, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.